We're taught that wars are fought with weapons, armies, and strategy. But the truth is far more uncomfortable and far more hidden. Modern wars are not powered by bravery, ideology, or even military strength. They are powered by money, invisible flows of capital, quiet financial agreements, massive debts, secret guarantees, an economic machinery so vast that most citizens never see it. Yet they pay for it, sometimes for generations. Because here's the mystery. How do nations actually afford war? Tanks cost millions. Fighter jets cost billions. A single long conflict can cost trillions. And almost no country has that kind of cash lying around. So how do governments fund conflicts that last 4 years? Sometimes decades. The answer reveals one of the most misunderstood realities of the modern world. Wars are financed long before they are fought, and paid for long after they end. Today, we're uncovering the hidden financial architecture behind modern conflict, a system that has shaped world history, fueled global power, and influenced every major war of the last century. To understand how wars are funded today, we need to travel back to a time when financing war was simple. Kings taxed their people, borrowed gold or seized wealth from conquered lands. But as armies grew and technology advanced, wars became too expensive for traditional methods. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European empires turned war finance into a kind of science. Britain used long-term government bonds to fund the Napoleonic Wars. The United States sold Liberty bonds to fund World War I. Nations discovered something remarkable. If you can borrow from your own citizens, from banks, and from foreign lenders, you can fight wars far larger than your economy should allow. But this discovery came with a twist, one that still shapes our world today. Wars no longer ended when the fighting stopped. Their financial shutout remained. The debts lived on. Interest payments stretched across decades. Entire monetary systems were reorganized to absorb wartime spending. And as war became more complex, so did the financial machinery behind it. Governments created central banks. They issued new forms of money. They designed global institutions. They built alliances, not just for military reasons, but for economic survival. The hidden truth of modern history is this. Wars are not just geopolitical events. They are financial events. And those financial events reshape the world long after the last shot is fired. The modern system of war finance began in the early 20th century. World War I was the first conflict too large to be paid for through taxes alone. European powers relied on massive government bonds, central bank lending, foreign borrowing, currency manipulation, and war-specific taxes. Britain and France borrowed heavily from the United States. Germany financed its war through debt and later through inflation. And when the war ended, governments didn't have enough money to repay the cost. This triggered a crisis that defined the next 2 decades. Hyperinflation, debt, defaults, and political instability. World War II followed the same pattern, but with new tools. The United States used war bonds to mobilize civilian savings. Britain borrowed from its empire, and from the US, Germany once again relied on debt and state control, and on exploiting occupied territories to fuel its military machine. But after World War II, something new happened, something that would define every future conflict. The global financial system was redesigned. The Bretton Woods Agreement created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Currencies were tied to the dollar, and the United States became the center of global finance. From that point on, wars would never be funded the same way again. After 1945, global conflict changed. Instead of direct wars between major powers, the Cold War created a new era of proxy conflicts, military alliances, and geopolitical standoffs. Funding these required a far more sophisticated approach, one that blended economics, diplomacy, and financial engineering. Defense budgets became permanent. Before World War II, large military budgets were temporary. After the Cold War began, massive defense spending became a permanent fixture in national budgets. Borrowing became standard. Countries realized they could borrow not for a few years, but for decades, spreading costs over multiple generations. Inflation could quietly reduce the real value of repayment. Bonds could be issued in wartime and refinanced later. War funding became a long-term financial program, not an emergency measure. The US dollar became the backbone of conflict. Because global commodities were priced in dollars, and the US controlled much of the world's financial infrastructure, nations discovered that war spending could be absorbed by the global system as long as it flowed through the dollar. Meanwhile, new institutions entered the picture. Central banks, global lenders, and international markets became part of war finance, providing stability, liquidity, and indirectly, the capacity to sustain long-term conflict. By the late 20th century, Modern wars no longer required immediate payment. They required credit, but eventually, the financial machinery used to fund conflict reaches a breaking point. This happens when borrowing becomes unsustainable. Currencies weaken, inflation rises, public support erodes, markets demand higher interest, or global partners lose patience. The Vietnam War is a key example. Massive U.S. spending contributed to inflation, deficits, and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. The dollar was forced off the gold standard. A financial earthquake felt around the world. The Soviet-Afghan War was another example. The USSR spent billions supporting its campaign, placing enormous pressure on an already struggling economy. Many historians believe this financial strain helped accelerate the Soviet collapse. The Iran-Iraq War pushed both nations into heavy long-term borrowing, destabilizing their economies for decades. And in the 2000s, Middle East conflicts added trillions of dollars to long-term U.S. national debt. Funding wars has consequences far beyond the battlefield, consequences that shape currencies, markets, and government policy. Long after the fighting ends, when the financial bill for war finally comes due, nations face higher taxes, larger deficits, inflation, slower growth, reduced public services, and long-term debt burdens. The cost is often generational. For example, interest payments on past U.S. wars will continue for decades, costing far more than the wars themselves. Post-conflict reconstruction often requires new loans, adding fresh debt on top of old debt. Veterans' health care and pensions can last 50 years or more after a war ends. War funding doesn't stop. When peace begins, its financial ripple effects continue indefinitely. Throughout history, nations have tried to reform how conflicts are financed. They've attempted stricter budgeting, war taxes, international treaties, spending caps, and balanced budget laws. But none of these measures last. Why? Because wars are unpredictable. Governments value financial flexibility. They need the ability to spend first and justify later. This creates a paradox. The better a nation is at funding war, the more likely it is to continue fighting them. The financial tools designed to stabilize economies often become the tools that enable conflict. Today, modern wars are funded through a combination of tools. Government borrowing remains the primary method. Nations issue bonds purchased by pension funds, banks, foreign governments, and central banks. Central banks themselves play a major role, keeping borrowing cheap by purchasing government debt or lowering interest rates. International alliances share costs or provide aid. Defense budgets and long-term contracts stretch spending over many years. Economic measures, like sanctions, resource control, and trade restrictions, shape the financial battlefield. And the private sector plays a massive role, with defense contractors, technology firms, and logistics companies funded indirectly through government spending. The modern landscape makes one thing clear. Economic power is military power. So, what should we take away from all of this? First, wars are funded long before they begin, and paid for long after they end. The public sees battles, but the real story is written in budgets, debt, and financial markets. Second, modern conflicts depend completely on financial systems. Banks, central banks, investors, and global institutions quietly shape the capacity for war. And third, the cost of war is not just economic. It's structural. Debt, inflation, and long-term obligations reshape entire societies. The true danger of modern war isn't just the fighting, it's the invisible financial architecture behind it. A system capable of sustaining conflict indefinitely also risks creating conflicts that never truly end. When money becomes the fuel, wars can continue far longer than nations can afford. If you want to understand the hidden forces behind global power, the financial systems, geopolitical strategies, and economic structures shaping our world, subscribe to The Dark Economy, because the real story of modern war isn't on the battlefield, it's in the balance sheets.